Now, a few more things to discuss with regard to reinforcement before we move on to the concept of punishment. It's also important that you keep in mind that there are schedules or time variables to reinforcements that are out there, okay? And so the first is continuous reinforcement. This is when you reward, okay, you provide that reinforcer, the reward, every time the desired response happens, okay? So this needs to take place when the initial learning is occurring. So a really good example of this would be when you're trying to potty train a child, okay? If any of you guys were ever able to remember back to when a little sibling has been potty trained, you know your parents, they reward them every single time that they start to go to the potty in the bathroom rather than using their diaper. And so they are rewarded and reinforced every single time that response happens until the desired end goal of being potty trained is met. Partial or intermittent reinforcement is when we reinforce a response in a variable scenario, okay? So the person that is carrying out those behaviors never knows when they'll be rewarded for it. These results are much slower to be acquired in the very beginning of this, process, but it does show the greatest amount of resistance to extinction from a person's behavior later on, okay? Because if a person never knows if they'll be rewarded, but that there will be a reward at some point, then you know that that's going to be able to stick a little bit longer. An example of this kind of scenario would be winning the lottery, okay? Buying lottery tickets. You never know if you're going to be that person that ends up winning. But at the end of the day, there's that slim possibility that maybe you could be. So as a result, you follow in line with this. All right, so within these reinforcement schedules, there are interval schedules and ratio schedules. Where ratio schedules are concerned, ratio is just a number, basically, and so that's what these mean, okay? Reinforcements are provided after various different ratios of responses. It just depends on when they're reinforced. In a fixed ratio schedule, the reinforcements are provided after a specified number of responses are hit. So reward cards are notorious for this. Buy 10, get one free. Subway is really well known for using the Subway card where you buy 6 subs and you get the 7th free. I think that's what it is. It's what it used to be when I was in high school. Piecework pay is another one. So if you work at a clothing manufacturer, your work is established in piecework pay. You make so many pieces of clothing, and that's how you earn your pay. Okay, so that's fixed ratio. Variable ratio just means that the reinforcements are provided after an unpredictable number of responses. Okay, so the person never knows when they're going to be rewarded, they just know that there's that possibility that it'll happen. So gambling would be the most common example of this. It kind of goes along with that intermittent scheduling of reinforcement from earlier. Now, this is going to be the one that produces the most responding from a person operantly than any other kind of method because they never know when they'll be rewarded, and so there's always that kind of little incentive to get it. But it's also the hardest to extinguish because of the unpredictability, okay? Second part to this is interval schedules. These are when you have reinforcements that occur after a specified time. Okay, so in our earlier one where ratio is concerned, it is reinforcers that occur after a specific number of responses. This is a scenario where it just occurs after a specific amount of time. So, big difference in those setups. An example of fixed interval is when you study for a test. Okay, if you study for it the night before, you take the test, that's going to be a fixed interval schedule, okay? The reinforcers are going to be presented after a very specified time has elapsed. Another scenario is your payday for work. I've alluded to this already. Teachers get paid every 2 weeks. So we know after every 2 weeks have hit, on the 1st and the 15th of a month, we're getting our reinforcer for the work that we carry out. So that's a fixed interval schedule. Variable interval, on the other hand, is when it's reinforced after an unspecified amount of time. Okay? These are slow, steady responses that are going to establish themselves. Again, so there's this kind of unpredictability towards it. So an example would be a pop quiz. Okay, if that's presented, you've got a very good opportunity of knowing that if you know that there are pop quizzes that are going to be given to you at various different points during a unit, for example, you'll be more inclined to study. Okay, fishing is one as well. You never know the amount of time that is going to occur between catching one fish versus another. You could go 3 straight times of going to, a lake and fishing but never getting a fish. And then you could have scenarios where you could go 3 straight days and you'll catch 15 of them in any day. Okay? Stargazing is another kind of example in this situation, because you go and you hope to be able to see a shooting star happen, but you never know the amount of time that's going to elapse before you get to see that star fall. So you can see, graphically speaking, and I would definitely star this, because one of the things that you need to know for this unit is how we can graphically represent learned responses over time. Okay, that's one of your objectives for this unit on Moodle's Objectives Guide for Unit 6 that we have posted up there. You can see these reinforcement schedules being graphed over a period of time. So fixed ratio, okay, it's going to be pretty straight up in terms of its influence in a behavior. And then as you move down, you get variable interval, which is going to establish for you slow and steady responding. Okay? Now let's talk punishment. This is going to be where we kind of wrap things up for the tail end of operant conditioning. Punishment is an aversive event that decreases the behavior that it follows. Okay, so punishment is always going to decrease behavior in theory. We're going to talk about why that's not always the case in a bit. Reinforcers will cause a behavior to increase. Punishment will, in theory, cause it to decrease. And just as we had with reinforcement, there are positive and negative punishments. Okay? So in positive punishment, this is when you provide a negative stimulus. Okay? So it's positive because you are giving a negative stimulus. That's why it's positive, because that ends up getting kids all kinds of mixed up. Possible examples of this are spanking. Okay? You give a negative, it's pain, all right? So you try to avoid having yourself in that situation again later on. Getting a parking ticket or a speeding ticket, okay, or just a fine in general. That's positive punishment because you are giving a negative, okay? You are giving them a consequence to that action. Negative punishment, on the other hand, this is when you remove or subtract or withdraw a desirable stimulus, so a positive thing. Okay, so positive punishment is when you add a negative, and negative punishment is when you remove a positive. In these scenarios, time out from certain privileges, okay? If you get your phone taken away from you, you are taking a desirable thing. Being grounded is something different because you're giving a negative. That's positive punishment. But if you are grounding in a scenario as getting, your Twitter page taken away from you, for example, we would perceive that as getting something good removed from us. So that's a negative punishment. If you get your driver's license revoked because of speeding issues or car accidents, that's a negative punishment because you are removing the positive, desirable stimulus of having your ability to drive and take yourself wherever you want to go. So those are examples of punishment. Again, can't stress it enough, write down these examples. The more examples that you get for yourself, the better prepared you'll be on that test. So, one last time, in positive punishment, you are giving a negative, but in negative punishment, it's also referred to as omission training. I would know that terminology. You are taking away, you're removing a positive. So we talked about classical conditioning and the cognitive processes that have to occur for classically conditioned responses to happen. Now we got to talk about the cognitive processes that have to go on when someone is being operantly conditioned. So there's evidence out there to show that cognitive processes during operant conditioning do happen, okay? And they know this through research done on rats again during mazes, okay, when they are attempting to navigate through a maze. when they go through it without an obvious reward, there's some level of cognitive process that is happening and going through that, okay? The individual that carried out this research is named Edward Tolman, okay? And Tolman found that the rats seem to develop cognitive maps or some levels of mental representation of the layout of a maze, their environment, because it blocked out the normal route, and so it had to find an alternative path in that research. So a rat went through a maze first, found a way out of it. There was a roadblock placed in it, so the rat wasn't able to use that again, and so it had to end up developing a map in its mind to be able to solve the problem and to operantly condition it. The detour would be the shortest path around the barrier, even though that route had not been reinforced in any manner. Okay? The rat just caught on to the fact that that would get it out. It gave it an alternative, even though there wasn't a reward attached to that alternative point. So we truly do believe, and evidence shows, that there is some brain imaging techniques that show the hippocampus as the structure in developing our cognitive map. We know the hippocampus is involved in storing new memories and establishing them through to the temporal lobe to store as long-term memories. And so we believe that the hippocampus is involved in cognitive map making in our brain when it comes to trying to solve problems, operantly speaking. So this whole process then of operantly conditioning oneself despite a level of reward is based on what Tolman refers to as latent learning. Okay, remember latent, if we talked about it in Sigmund Freud's Unit 5 states of consciousness, that's the hidden under the surface portion of things, okay, not consciously aware of it. Latent learning is that learning that happens without reinforcement, but that becomes apparent when some level of incentive is given later on. Okay, so Tolman allowed the rats to just wander around in those mazes for multiple hours, just to do whatever they wanted, just to do it freely. And then later, when the rats were offered some kind of reinforcement for getting through the maze, the one who wandered around ran through the maze faster because it had carried out this level of latent learning and established a cognitive map. Okay, and so that occurred faster than those who had not been through the maze initially. So we can have a level of operant conditioning be present in our behavior without it being reinforced initially speaking. But once that incentive is given later on, we find that it's there. And so it is a scenario of operant conditioning, even though it is not immediately present. The other thing to discuss is biological predispositions. We talked about it with classical conditioning. Now we've got to talk about it with operant. The biological constraints within us as humans or within animals is that we naturally learn our associations to adapt. Okay, we know this from the classical conditioning discussion. Marion Bailey ended up finding in her studies over this whole concept of operant conditioning and the biological parameters of it, she noticed that animals drift toward biologically predisposed instinctual behaviors. So she called that something like instinctual drift. And if you think about it, the reinforcement in that scenario is survival. Okay? It's our ability to continue on and to be living on this planet. That's the reinforcer in that. We naturally drift towards things that are naturally predisposed within us as instinct, okay, and that drive to survive. And the reason why that is because it's a primary natural reinforcer, that desire to survive. So, this is the very end of operant conditioning notes. It was a lot. I know you're probably going to be pretty confused when you've gone through this, so I would really recommend, if you've got the time, to go back through this now. At the end of the day, though, we are going to do our best to make sure that you've got all of this clarified for you in the best possible way when we're working together in class with one another.